Hey there, Smite fans, and welcome to an SBL Spring Split recap video and post-split discussion video. So what this is going to be is a quick recap of the Spring Split for those who were unable to watch it or just want a quick refresher before DreamHack starts up, as well as what exactly we can see come from these teams after the split has been finished now. So obviously 6 of them are going to be going to DreamHack, and we will be talking about that later. And a few of them will be going to Relegations. We'll also be talking about that, and then what we can expect to see from the other teams. So right now on your screen, if you click on the SBL logo up at the top, then you will be able to be taken directly to the Spring Split recap. If you click on any of the teams' names, it will take you to the post discussion where I start talking about that team. And if you click on the DreamHack logo that should be popping up right about now, then you can go directly to when I talk about the DreamHack. So the first thing we're going to be covering here is the Spring Split. What happened during those days? What did we see? And because of that, it will subsequently mean what can we expect. So starting out in the split, what we had was kind of a typical expectations. Obviously, with all these 16 teams that you can see right now, we kind of knew going into the split what teams we had expectations for some of these teams. We thought, Eager and Luminosity and Envy, they look really strong in an A. Obviously Panthera, the returning world champs, Paradigm, and at the time, personally, I thought Fnatic was going to be up in the top 3. As we saw the split unfold, those weren't all necessarily true. In fact, Luminosity being in the top 3 there was one of the very first upsets that we got to see. The first day of the SBL, the last set, Enemy versus Luminosity. Enemy had just kicked all 3 of the members, and come back into the split. And while in the Super Regionals and then at Worlds, everybody was like, well, there's no way Enemy's going to be able to do anything. There's no way Enemy's going to be that great. And then they kick 3 of their members. Everybody's like, well, there's no way that Luminosity's going to drop it. Enemy 2-0'd them almost with no problem. Now, that same day, we did get to see Eager kind of showing off their strength, and the reason I mention that is because when you look later in the very first week, Envy took out Eager. And if you remember those games, it wasn't a really close set. Envy definitely held themselves ahead, and they kind of steamrolled, and the rest of it all kind of fit exactly where we wanted to see it. Hungry for More did get 2-0'd by Leftovers, Fnatic was getting splits, and all in all, it kind of set the groundwork. Enemy was going to be at the top. Envy and Eager were contesting, but Panthera and Paradigm were very obviously, and they're still in their top positions. Then we moved on to week 2. Enemy once again came out, but this time the first match was against the Randozos, so while they were still doing really well, it wasn't against the best team in the split at all. So while we're looking through it, we actually get to see Allegiance showing a little bit of improvement, Denial and them splitting, Envy and Soar both showing some improvement, Cringe Crew actually bringing themselves up a little bit towards this split, and honestly, with this week, I think the biggest thing was the fact that Denial was able to take a game off of Enemy. Now, the last couple weeks of the Spring Split, it was obvious which teams were the strongest, but in the first couple weeks, seeing Enemy, after their dominant performances that they've had, lose a game to Denial, who wasn't necessarily the strongest at this point in time, was very impressive. Of course, then we get to see Envy, through all of the troubles they had this split, they did end up getting 2-0'd by LG at the very end, and things like this have kind of been shaping the way the split goes. Now, the reason these matches were very important is because the first couple weeks, it was really hard to tell who was going to be on top. Other than Panthera, there was no real obvious number 1 team for either region. All of them were kind of splitting, and we get to see that even going into the next week. Enemy was still going to take 2-0, but Soar was starting to do a little bit better. Soar 2-0 Denial here. And while we were looking at it, the teams that were starting to come on top weren't necessarily the ones we thought we would see. Enemy and Soar were just kind of skyrocketing to the top. Paradigm and Panthera were there. Panthera making themselves have a large lead very early on. But all the other teams were really, really close, and honestly, they were kind of in a jumble. Envy, throughout the entire split, especially these first 5 weeks, kind of had some solid goings, and then it started to go downhill, and that actually would bring us down towards kind of the middle of the split. Weeks 4, 5, and 6 are really the ones to look at here. So weeks 4 and 5 was relatively important because we got to see a lot of improvement. Once again, Panthera, Eager, Enemy and Soar, Paradigm, all of them were showing themselves to be relatively strong, but I think the most impressive match that came out of all of those was when Panthera went up against Cringe Crew. It wasn't the same thing that you expect from these other matches where Panthera just demolishes who they go up against. It was close. And this was a week that Cringe Crew, it was right after their solo laner had lost his privilege to play Smite. He was banned. They had Defiance, their coach, playing with them. And it seemed like they were a completely different team. What was weird was earlier that week, they lost 2-0 to Dig, but when it came to Panthera, they were able to take a game. And while if you watched any of my prediction videos, I actually used that to hype up Cringe Crew as we went along. It turns out that one wasn't necessarily a fluke, but they got really strong for a couple weeks, and then they kind of started to fall off again, as we get to see. When we got into about week 5, everything seemed like it was starting to fall into place. Denial was 2-0ing Envy not really being at the top of their game anymore. Eager 2-0 the Randozos. It was relatively, it was easy for them. Randozos themselves haven't necessarily been the strongest team this split, although they definitely got better through the weeks. Enemy and Soar still kind of competing with each other. The lower half of EU was still really close, but the top half of EU was also really close, save for the fact that Panthera was just towering over everybody else. And what got really interesting was around here we saw Luminosity kind of faltering. It was in week 5 that I started to lose a little bit of hope for Luminosity as they split with Allegiance, and then later that week they split with the Randozos. Now, Allegiance does have some really strong players on it, and they did get a lot better towards the end of the split, especially with their pickup of Weekend towards the end. But with the Randozos, it was a completely different kind of scenario. The Randozos had been this team that hadn't won a single game, and then they finally get one, and it's off of Luminosity, and everybody was kind of surprised there. And it wasn't necessarily a bad match either. They were really close. It was really strong performance coming out of them, and it gave me a little bit of hope for the Randozos. Not enough to bring them out of the bottom of NA, but enough that made them shine through. Now, between weeks 5 and 6, and the reason that I wanted to split this into 2 halves is mainly because between week 5 and 6, there was a bye week. There was the spring fling went on. It was a charity event held by Hi-Rez, and then the next week SPL resumed. And honestly, when the SPL resumed, it was like watching a completely different set of teams. Soar comes back, and they're strong. Luminosity came back, and they were much stronger. Eager and Denial both came back, showed themselves to be really strong. So now we have 4 or 5 teams in NA that are really, really close to each other in skill level, but nobody really showing who's on top except Enemy was still just sitting up there. The other thing that came as a surprise, and this actually brings us to probably one of my favorite stories for the split, Hungry for More. In the first 5 weeks, Hungry for More was kind of They played and it honestly just didn't feel right with them. Their teamwork just wasn't quite there. The shot calls weren't quite there. As all of it was just kind of like a puzzle that was almost but not quite fully completed. And it seems like they figured out how to solve that puzzle in the bye week, because they came back week 6 and 2-0'd Paradigm. Not necessarily like it was nothing, but with some relative ease. Paradigm, I did find out later, was having some personal issues at that time. There were things going on with some of the players that wasn't exactly making it the best for them to play, but as we see it, Paradigm that week was actually falling relatively low. They 1-1'd with Torpedo, of all people, and got 2-0'd by Hungry for More, but the Hungry for More story was really more that team was getting better, and we'll see that as the rest of the weeks come down. Enemy came in and showed how Envy had been doing, and Envy, honestly, when they came back after this split, or after that bye week, they just did not seem like the same team. Enemy, Soar, LG, and Eager, and honestly Denial all came back, and the top 5 NA were all really, really close and competitive, and the bottom 3 NA were really, really close and competitive. And Envy and Allegiance, honestly, both going through a lot of roster changes kind of through this entire split, swapping teams, swapping positions in the team, and honestly sometimes dropping members that they thought were underperforming. We actually saw Envy be the second team to drop a game to the Randozos, and the Randozos had very strong early game. The entire split, their team was very strong in the early game, but as it came down, their team didn't seem to have the same kind of shot-calling presence that the other teams had that they needed in order to stay competitive with them. And as we see towards the end of the split, and as you saw earlier in this video, that left them with a score of 2-26. Unfortunately for them, that is not necessarily a good score, but they still have a lot of really good players. So after week 6, when everything kind of seemed a little topsy-turvy from that bye week, especially in EU, we come back, week 7 seemed a little bit more solidified, and honestly, for the rest of the split, everything seemed a little bit more solidified. Eager was sitting up at the top, Soar was sitting up at the top, Luminosity, Enemy were actually splitting in some of these scenarios. Dignitas was starting to play a little bit better, as though they were showing themselves to be, honestly, a middle of the pack. The entire split, they were having off and ons. They'd either get 2-0'd, 2-0, or 1-1. Like, every single match with Dignitas would go one way or the other. There was never really a good way to predict that team, honestly. Whereas when you look at other teams, like one I haven't mentioned a lot at all, Fnatic, and honestly Torpedo at this point, they were in EU, and they played well, but they just weren't quite as good as the rest of the teams. And that's where we kind of see Panthera at this point. I think they qualified for DreamHack in week 8 or week 9. They were the first team to do so, and as we saw them through the entire split, while they did actually end up dropping 4 games total, a couple of those, one of those was not necessarily a fluke, but I'll get to that one in a little bit. But as it came down to it, Panthera was showing themselves to be at the top. Cringe Crew had been showing themselves to be a top 3 team, and then they started to falter. Dignitas was proving themselves to be in the middle of the pack, and when it came down to Leftovers, Fnatic, and Torpedo, Leftovers slowly were digging themselves up higher. And the thing that kind of came down with it was that Panthera changed the paradigm of the meta of the game. And not just to use Paradigm's name there, but all the teams had to get better if they wanted to do anything against Panthera. And so Paradigm got better, and so we see Hungry for More get loads better. We see Cringe Crew getting better. And all of the teams, except really Fnatic and Torpedo, seemed to change and honestly evolve as the weeks went on. The most impressive things that kind of happened in the later weeks were, honestly, some of the splits that were happening in NA. Denial was showing themselves to be incredibly strong. Luminosity was showing themselves to get incredibly strong. Eager was showing themselves to be a little bit more of a dominant force than they had, but Enemy and Soar were very, very competitive. What actually was most impressive to me is that Eager and Soar, and in fact in week 8 you can see they actually had a split. These teams were neck and neck. Like, even up to the end, both of their scores ended up being 20-8, 20 wins, 8 losses, both sitting tied for technically second place here. And both of them going to be going to DreamHack because of it. It's going to be, that's going to be fun to watch. Both of these teams evolving as the split went on. Even in an interview with Zapman towards the end there, they were asking what exactly, how did you feel at the beginning of the split? Because Eager wasn't doing so hot, and then towards the end of it, they were like, man, we're going to DreamHack. But when we get to, weeks 8, 9, 10... honestly, week 8 was a very, I want to say a difficult week because there was a lot of splits. And honestly, there were a lot of teams kind of faltering. So Envy had been going through a lot of roster changes. Denial was showing themselves to be strong. They win a 1-1 up against Soar. Eager managed a 2-0 Luminosity, kind of putting Luminosity down towards their 4th, 5th place spot that they were fighting for. Allegiance picked up Weekend, and that kind of changed the game for them. So Envy, having changed their roster however many times at this point, was now kind of sitting at the bottom of the rung. They weren't playing really well, and Allegiance managed to come out and pull themselves a little bit a little bit above the rest of the teams. And we'll see why that plays an important thing when I pull the brackets back up in a little bit when I start talking about the post-split discussion. But that was very important. Now, the other thing that was really weird was Cringe Crew and Dignitas, even though for a couple weeks had been showing themselves to be these really strong teams, seemed to falter here. Part of it is that Hungry for More, when they faced up against Cringe Crew and when they faced up against Dignitas, were just so much better than they had been at the beginning of the split. But part of it we got to see was Cringe Crew's teamwork and Dignitas' teamwork, honestly, just kind of faltering. The teams weren't doing as well as they had been. And that really started to play its role towards the end when you're trying to qualify for DreamHack. And some of these teams at this point, they were really honestly trying to fight not to go to relegations. And that's kind of where Allegiance and Envy were sitting, both of them trying to fight better. The rest of the weeks, honestly, or the rest of that week in week 8 was relatively normal. The most notable was probably Eager and Soar splitting, just showing once again the competitive nature in North America. Going into week 9, where this one was a lot more solid, as well as week 10. When it came down to it, we got to see Envy once again just not really doing that fact. In fact, the beginning of week 9 was probably the most disgraceful thing that happened in the SBL, honestly, in its history. Envy trolling and then an early surrender. Ended up finding all members of the team. It cost them a lot of money there, but as it stood, everyone kind of expected Soar to 2-0 anyway, so it wasn't much. They were just in a losing scenario. Luminosity kind of showing themselves to be in that 4th, 5th place slot. Enemy, once again, honestly, that match was probably the most interesting of Week 9. Enemy made Eager look like a Challenger Cup team. And that's not to say that Eager played poorly. Eager played amazingly. Enemy just played better. And that's like where it came down to it. Enemy, the entire split, and especially in these last couple weeks, didn't want to lose anymore, it felt like. And they were showing themselves off to be very strong. We also get to see another loss that Panthera managed to pick up. We did see Paradigm take a game off them earlier, and honestly, it wasn't too surprising to see that because even members of Panthera said that Paradigm were looking really strong. They won't be surprised if they lose. And then Hungry for More decided once again that they were going to be this really strong team. They came in, they managed to take a game off of Panthera, and Hungry for More looked amazing in that set. And honestly, for the rest of their games, they looked and played very, very well. And as we actually ended up getting to see, Cringe Crew did kind of pull themselves together for this last week. They did 2-0 Fnatic and Leftovers there. That gave them a little bit of a tie. They had to fight now Hungry for More for that 3rd place spot. At this point, we had Enemy, Soar, Eager, Panthera, and Paradigm were pretty much guaranteed to be going to DreamHack. Those were the teams that everyone expected. And once again, the end of Week 9, Enemy 2-0ing Denial, showing themselves that they want to be the top seed. The end of Week 9 leads very well into the beginning of Week 10 because we pretty much got to see Enemy 2-0 Allegiance, which honestly no one was really surprised. Allegiance was more fighting not to go to relegations than they were fighting to go to DreamHack. But as it stood, the next most surprising thing, honestly, that came out of it, there were 2 this week that really threw me off personally. Fnatic showed up against Dignitas, and part of it was because they had a sub and they played phenomenally, and the other part of it was just the fact that Dignitas hadn't really been playing that strongly, and the team themselves was kind of faltering towards the end of the split. Luminosity also was able to fight up against Soar. Luminosity had been kind of faltering in the middle of the split, so seeing them come back was a very impressive feat. And the other thing that kind of impressed me, especially for this team and the fact that they had a little bit of a debut, Envy bringing in its final week roster honestly looked really strong. And I firmly believe if Envy had this roster in Week 5, Week 4, Week 6 even, and had the time to kind of build upon it and expand it and get the friendship and teamwork that they needed, I think Envy could have been vying, maybe not for the top 3 spots here, but definitely the 4th and 5th spot. They would have been able to, I guess, have a more competitive nature themselves. Unfortunately for them, it wasn't so. The rest of the week went relatively normally, and we do get to see now the split kind of finalizing itself. Most of the teams that were winning were the ones everyone expected to win. Cringe Crew did drop a game to Torpedo, which was a bit unfortunate for them, but as it stood, it wasn't as important as the matchup they had earlier that week against Panthera, because that was the one that determined if they were going to go to DreamHack or not, or tie at least. But as it stood towards the end, the only real surprise towards the end of the split came out of it was Panthera dropping a game to Leftovers. But for those who didn't know, iRaffer, the support for Panthera, his father had passed away, and the team was just trying to cheer him up by playing around and having fun with the game. And honestly, as it stood, it would work as a really good team-building exercise, but just trying to cheer up their buddy was a pretty good job from them. And so bringing back in the standings, you get to see Enemy kind of at a commanding lead with 22-6 and an A, and Panthera at a much more commanding lead at 24-4, only losing 4 games the entire split. And honestly, they really only lost, I want to say 3 games the entire split, but that last game was, I mean, it's still a loss no matter what you count it on. So 24-4, not a bad thing for them to go. And honestly, the thing that surprises me the most is the 3-way tie that we have kind of for the seeding. Paradigm, Soar, and Eager all going 20-8. Now, all 3 were able to manage to get to DreamHack, but just having that tie kind of, honestly, kind of surprising. Hungry for More finishing at 17-11. Those 11 wins, honestly, were towards the beginning of the split, where the team was relatively rough getting new, as I was discussing, and the 17 wins, honestly, being some of the best games that I think I've seen a team play in a while. It's kind of like a Titan story that we had last year in Season 2, except this time they were in the Pro League the entire time. Now, Luminosity and Denial were probably the next close for contending to go to DreamHack, but both of these teams are looking very strong. Both Luminosity finishing at 17 and 11, like hungry for more. And we actually see Denial at 15 and 13, which is the same that Cringe Crew went, which was also showing to be sitting around in the right spot in the middle of the pack in EU, sitting at 4th place, just above Team Dignitas, sitting at 11 and 17, who was... They had mixed games, as I had discussed. Allegiance and Leftovers, 9 and 19, both sitting in the 6th place slots. And then Envy, 7 and 20, and Fnatic, 8 and 20. The reason Envy is short a game is because they, essentially the one match that they early surrendered as such was not counted as a game for them to get paid for, so they really only got 27 out of the 28 matches they were supposed to play. But as it stands, they were sitting at 7 and 20, and like I said, if we had seen that roster that they had in the last week, that might have been a different score, but Fnatic and Torpedo both sitting at the bottom of EU, sitting 8 and 20, and the Randozos at the very bottom at 2 and 26. Now this brings me into what I will have as the post-split discussion. So for this part, I'm mainly going to be talking about the teams that didn't qualify for DreamHack, and the reason that is because I have a spot for DreamHack after this one. So once we, why don't we just look at it? What do we expect to see out of mainly the 4th, 5th, and 6th teams from each region? So Luminosity, I think, might have some roster changes. But as it stands, I kind of wish they wouldn't. I think the team's really strong. I think they're going to have a little bit more to work on. And if they practice through the summer, by the time the fall split rolls around, they're going to be vying for a very top spot. And if NA can stay as competitive as it was for this split, it's going to be amazing to watch. The same thing kind of goes for Denial. Denial was one of those teams that it started out kind of rough, but once they were able to start working themselves together and get a little bit better with each other, it was very obvious that this team was going to be one of the top. And I think that they still have the potential to. They just need to work a little bit harder, practice maybe a little bit more. There might, once again, maybe some roster changes, but I don't really see it. I actually think Benji, who was the solo laner, did retire for Denial. So maybe if they can find someone who fits the spot very, very well, they will be finding themselves in a very nice competitive spot. Honestly, as weird as this seems to say it, I think Allegiance is in the same spot, even though they did kind of poorly as the game went on. As the split went on, they were still able to do a lot for their team as the end. When Weekend was picked up, it was the shot caller that the team needed. The atmosphere, from what they've said, got a lot better. And honestly, I think that has made them in a bit more of a position where they could be competitive. They need to work out a lot of kinks. They need to decide a little bit more. I won't be surprised if there were some roster changes or people just, retiring, quitting Smite, but as it stands, the team themselves could be very good this next split if they work out some of the kinks over the summer. Looking over to EU, Cringe Crew, once again, they're looking for, I think they need a manager as well as a solo laner now. Their original solo laner this year did get banned, and they said they might want him back if he is able to appeal his ban, but as it stands, Axios, they said, was just not fitting the role as well as they wanted it to, so they're looking for some new players. I think the team could come back and be very competitive, but unless they can find someone who fits the role really, really well, they're not going to have too much of a great time, still probably sitting in that 4th, 5th spot. Dignitas kind of in the same position. They need some roster changes, or they need to crack down very, very hard. If they can come through and do what they were doing kind of in the middle of the spring split, where everything was, honestly, was going their way. They were playing really well, even though it seemed like it was the Sun Touch and Shadow Nightmare show. They can at least come back. If they can get maybe a little bit higher tier members to play, or at least work really hard on their teamwork, then I could very well see this team going very far. Still, right now, if they keep what they have, probably sitting middle of the pack. And then once again for the Leftovers, this team honestly just needs a little bit of polishing. I think with a good coach, with a good set of work ethic, this team could become one of the top teams. They could definitely keep competing with some of the top teams. And they were getting a little bit better towards the end there, and I'm excited to see what can come of them. They have a lot going for them right now, and as it goes towards the end, I think that they're going to be able to bring themselves up as long as they decide that they want to work just hard enough to keep themselves going. Now, looking at the bottom 2 teams of each region, the reason I kept these 2 separate is because these are the teams that will be going to the relegations, and these are the teams that, honestly, some of them, it's going to be interesting. So we don't know who from the Challenger Cup is going to be fighting with them, but the Challenger Cup going on right now, some of those teams will be coming in, and they will be fighting for these spots in the SPL. Randozos has a chance in relegations, I will say it. Randozos is going to be very strong. I think that they have a lot to work on, but they mainly need a shot caller. From what I could tell, their team seemed kind of to be all over the place case when they got to late game. Early game, their calls were really good. The team was really strong, but as they went towards the late game, it just wasn't as strong. So I think they need to maybe look at some roster changes, or at least just a lot of practice, honestly, because they have the chance to polish themselves up. They could probably get into maybe not the top spots. They could work themselves into the middle of the pack, though. With a little bit of work, they could definitely go up there. The same kind of goes for Torpedo. Torpedo, while they did have some, these superstars of old school days, when you come into what we have now, they aren't necessarily as strong. And so what we're having to look at is Torpedo. They have to kind of shine and polish. They could maybe work themselves up to the middle of the pack, but once again, some roster changes and a lot of practice are really what they need. For Torpedo and Randozos, honestly, if I wouldn't be too surprised after watching some of the Challenger Cup teams play. I wouldn't be too surprised if they lose their spots. However, when it comes down to Fnatic and Envy, the story is a little bit different. So 2 weeks ago, I would have said that Envy absolutely would lose in relegations. Envy would not be able to take it. Envy would lose wholeheartedly. But after seeing how they performed in that very last week, after seeing this roster that's now on your screen play together, I think they could do it. I think they could definitely beat out in relegations. And honestly, I think they could prove themselves to be a very competitive SPL team. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. I think the team's maybe going to be looking, some of them at retiring, some of them at maybe finding new members. I think Dust, honestly, is SPL material here. And I think he made a difference in the team. And I think having Dust would actually help. And honestly, he could be a top ADC in A with a little bit of shine and polish and practice. And the same thing kind of goes for Fnatic. They had Nulissa playing with them. And it seemed like a completely different team that played when they were up in that last week. They not only seemed to be having a little bit more fun with it, but they were playing the game just fundamentally better. Like they had been practicing really hard. And as it stands, it looked very strong for them. And honestly, for both of those teams, Envy and Fnatic, if they could just keep that going for themselves, relegations aren't going to be much of a problem for them, and I think that their SPL debuts and fights will be very much better if they can shine and practice and polish. But they do still have some work to kink out. Those teams we saw in the last week are the ones that I'd like to see. If we don't get to see those, I'm not entirely sure what we will see come out of them, but as it stands, I think those two teams are going to be going relatively well, and I think they will make it through. And now to cover the top 3 teams of each region and talk a little bit about DreamHack as we go through and get a little bit of predictions going on for that and what I expect to see out of these teams. So the first things first, obviously, Enemy Soar and Team Eager are the NA teams that qualified for DreamHack, and Panthera, Paradigm, and Hungry for More are the teams that qualified from Europe. Right now, they released the bracket, so you'll be seeing that come onto your screen, and you'll get to see there are some other teams that are going to be showing up here. We have OMG coming from China, and the Red Candids and Chaos Latin Gamers are going to be coming from Latin America and Brazil. So, as we see it, we're going to be the first one seeing Red Candids versus the Chaos Latin Gamers. Going to be fighting for that spot, but then the rest of the bracket going to be going relatively in the way of what we would expect to see. So, Panthera versus OMG. So, that is going to be, honestly, kind of interesting. I always love watching the Chinese players play, and Panthera's coming in with what we like to call the first seed curse. So, pretty much every LAN tournament when you've come in as a first seed has been relatively bad for your team. You don't tend to win. And so Panthera, if they do have that curse, might end up falling either in this or in the semifinals. Honestly, as it stands, I expect to see them kind of have an easy time with China. I think China will have a good learning experience here, but Panthera is a raid boss, and so it's going to be very interesting to watch that set. Eager versus Hungry for More is going to be so fun to watch. Hungry for More playing the way they did these last couple weeks, I think is going to have a very strong chance against Eager. Depends really on how much both teams have been practicing, and I think they will be cracking down relatively hard because DreamHack is going to be a very tough bracket for them, because either way they're going to have to either fight China or Panthera, and honestly, if China can take down Panthera, these teams have a lot to worry about, and if Panthera takes down China, then these teams have to worry about Panthera. So no matter what, this side of the bracket is going to be very competitive. Where you go down, Enemy is either going to be having to face a Latin American or a Brazil team, so I don't think they're going to drop a game. Until maybe the semifinals, there might be some troubles, but as it stands, they're going to have to go up against Paradigm or Soar, which, like I said, these two teams both went 20-8 in the split. So honestly, watching them, if Paradigm plays the way they were at the end of the split, I think those are going to be some really close games. I don't even know who to call it as yet. When they add this to the ticket, I will be doing a prediction video. But as of right now, the thing to remember is that Paradigm will not have Trickstank there. Trickstank will be taking exams, so Soar having a little bit of advantage while Paradigm doesn't have their usual support. And honestly, as it goes, just looking at the brackets as they are, all of these matches are going to be really fun to watch, but the semifinals and the finals are going to be absolutely insane. I don't know exactly who will make it there, but as you can see, tune in June 18th through the 21st. They're going to be some phenomenal games. And so what I kind of expect to see out of that is honestly maybe a recap of Worlds. I think it's going to be Enemy versus Panthera. There's no guarantees. There could be some upsets honestly going down, but as it stands, I think Enemy and Panthera will prove themselves to kind of come up above the rest. But that'll do it really for the split. Thank you for sitting through all of this. I know it's a lot to kind of get down and get into. Honestly, the split recap, if you weren't watching, pretty much look at the brackets, the top 3 teams. You can look mainly at the scores to see who you think will do best, but there are always going to be upsets, and honestly, it's going to be some really interesting games as we transition. Relegations will be a very interesting thing to watch for the opposite reason. It's going to be nice to see some fresh teams show up, as well as see if the current teams that are down at the bottom keep their rosters, or what's going to happen with that. Some teams may need to polish, some teams may need to re-roster work their team. But as it stands, the biggest thing happening going to be soon is DreamHack. Make sure you watch those games. I know I will. I will be putting out a prediction video if it gets added to the season ticket. Otherwise, I'll be putting out a prediction video anyway. As it stands, I mean, thank you guys for watching, especially if you sat through all of this. As always, it was very fun, and I hope to talk to you again soon.